So good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Orla and I'm Director of the Information Law and Policy Centre, one of the academic centres based here at the University of London. And we are delighted that you are able to all join us here today for the Centre's annual lecture and annual conference, which this year focuses on the theme of AI and power, regulating risk and rights. I do hope that I will not be replaced by a generative AI bot at next year's conference, but let's just see how things go. We have an excellent program for you over the next 2 days, with leading academic experts, policymakers, practitioners, and representatives from industry and civil society. Our panels will be exploring key questions on different approaches to AI governance, such as the different models adopted in the UK, EU, South America, and the US, and by international bodies including the OECD, the societal and legal impacts of AI systems and the diverse ways in which AI may empower society through new technologies that enable medical breakthroughs and what have revolutionized early diagnoses systems for diseases like cancer, and AI models that can help researchers predict patterns to tackle climate change. But also, there will be a focus on how the abuse and misuse of AI systems through applications such as mass facial recognition, predictive policing, and online disinformation may also be used in ways that threaten human rights and shift the balance between individuals, the state, industry, and undermine the rule of law and democratic values. Finally, we will also explore, and papers will address, if risk-based approaches to AI regulation and governance, such as the EU AI Act, ensure the adequate protection and oversight of human rights. We're very excited about the fact that this is going to be a very rich conversation that is multidisciplinary and cross-sector, with perspectives and insights from eminent speakers and attendees who join us from all over the UK, Europe, South America, Africa, and the US. And on that note, it is such an honor and a very great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dana Boyd. Dana is a partner researcher at Microsoft Research and a distinguished visiting professor at Georgetown University. She has also been recently appointed Professor of Communications at the University of Cornell. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology and society, with an eye to how structural inequities shape and are shaped by technologies. She is currently conducting a multi-year ethnographic study of the US Census to understand how data are made legitimate. Her previous work is focused on media manipulation, algorithmic bias, privacy practices, social media, and teen culture. Her monograph, It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Network Teens, has received widespread praise. She founded the Research Institute Data and Society, where she currently serves as an advisor. She's also a trustee of the Computer History Museum, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of the Advisory Board at the Electronic Privacy Information Centre. Dana, you're very welcome. In terms of format for this morning, Dana will speak for about 35 minutes, and then we will begin our keynote panel, which takes place afterwards all here. We will then have some time afterwards for Q&A, which Dana will also be joining. So I would like to thank all of our speakers, all of our discussants, chairs, and all of you attending for being here today. And I will now invite Dana Boyd to deliver the ILPC's annual lecture for 2024, entitled Interventions, Not Solutions in the Era of AI Policymaking.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing this morning? I am excited to be here with you today. That's one of the things I've been thinking about. Lots of people are talking about AI. In fact, when I arrived here in London, people are like, what are you here for? I'm like, you're talking about AI? And they're like, oh yeah, of course. Which conference? There's so many conferences. I'm like, no, this is going to be fun. So I'm very honored to be here today because it's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of aspects of policymaking. There's a lot happening around the world there. So I'm going to assume that everyone in here cares at some level about policymaking with an eye towards the idea of thinking about what it means to create a more responsible situation. And in terms of thinking about that, my goal today is to invite you to think more holistically. So I'm going to focus specifically on the AI policies themselves, but on the holistic approach to understanding how to think about AI policymaking. And in particular, I'm going to offer a handful of different frames and examples to go there. So to begin, I want to start with a concept that is very familiar in my discipline, in science and technology studies, but might not be as familiar if you're coming from a different space. And the idea has to do with technological determinism. So determinism, simply put, is the idea that if X, then Y. And so when we pair it with technology, we start to think about how a particular technology is introduced into an equation in a way to make a certain kind of outcome inevitable. And the problem with this mindset is it's often used by technologists to make promises that they can't deliver on, right? And so we see this problem of how technological determinism becomes a roadmap or a frame of reference to do things. Now, I want to be clear that when the system is very simplistic, deterministic thinking isn't particularly problematic. So if I use the correct key on the door, it will open, right? That is a deterministic logic. But again, we're talking about a very simple system, right? And things can go wrong, right? You could actually break the key, you could break the door lock could be changed, there's a variety of different conditions, but for the most part, we think of this as working. But as we start to expand the frame of reference, as we start to think more holistically about it, we start to see where this breaks down. So the idea that if I lock my house, no unwelcome visitors will enter is where things start to break down, right? Now that doesn't mean that we don't want to have values to locks. Of course locks have values. It adds friction to an equation, and that friction is extremely valuable. It makes it harder to enter the house, right? Because you actually have to either break that or go and break the window. Right? And so we start to think about these interventions as changing the playing field. And of course, one of the major reasons that we talk about locks on doors is because if you lock your door and your neighbor doesn't, the interest shifts to your neighbor, right? And so we end up with also a broader social complex issue. So the next layer to that, which is where we get a technology sensibility, has to do with technological solutionism, right? So if we think of determinism as if X, then Y, the way the technological solutionism tends to operate is we have Y, therefore we want to look back and have X because we're going to solve the problem with our thing. And this is what happens when a salesperson, of course, comes around and be like, I have something to sell you, and I'm going to narrate the problems that you didn't even know you had because I've got the solution for them. And this is one of those places where you start to see people, for example, selling locks because they're going to tell you that crime is on the rise, right? And if you just get a lock, it will all be solved. So the thing that's interesting to me is that solutionistic framing is very common in the tech industry, in part because people get really excited to work on solving a problem, a technical problem, and then they have to find a business model, right? So they're hoping that they can sell it to you. And so the other reason that this becomes hugely challenging is because of how the financing works around a particular system. And so you have this moment, and it occurs whether we're talking about national funding entities. And I don't know enough about the British academic funding agencies, but in the US, the National Science Foundation makes you do these impact statements where they quickly turn into, I will solve cancer with my one little technical intervention that will take the next 3 years, right? And this becomes a way you normalize justifying research and the way that you normalize things in venture capital. Right? Which is that I will make you billions of dollars because I will do this magnificent thing with my one little piece of technology, right? So this starts to actually narrate a return on investment kind of rhetoric. And we can come back to thinking about aspects of this more holistically. So many, and by the way, I'm drawing somewhat in this talk on this paper that I wrote with a bunch of my colleagues, which is sort of a fun paper looking at some of these solutionistic dynamics. So many critics in the tech industry critics of the tech industry have mocked the tech industry for its deeply solutionistic frame. I come from a field where we're like, and we make comments like, look at these companies, they're doing this. But there's something that's actually been happening recently that I've been really fascinated by, which is that the critics of this space have become just as deterministic as the technology companies themselves. Instead of saying that these technologies, if they're designed, are going to, cure cancer, we've switched to this technology will destroy democracy. This technology will destroy kids. This technology will do all of these harms just by its very existence. This is just as deterministic in terms of a frame of reference as the thing that we mock the tech industry for. So I think finding this in particular happening as the generative AI models have come out, right? Which is that we're having this massive conversation about what's going to happen to the labor force, what's going to happen to, the future of creativity, the future of art. And my little brain goes off and goes ding, 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 ding. We've got a problem here when we're making these claims. And the reason that that is a problem is that deterministic thinking is not just something that is problematic on its own. It's something that normalizes certain futures and makes certain futures more possible. So when we are going out there and we're fear-mongering, this is going to change, we stop looking at the broader ecosystem and we just focus on the technology. So it's one of those simple things. The technology is not going to fundamentally disrupt all forms of the future of work, but our economic arrangements that are being used around that and to justify it very well might. The interesting twist, and I forgot an O, the interesting twist to all of this is that I've started to watch lawmakers actually take it to the next level, and this is supposed to say techno-legal solutionism, because I've been grumbling about this dynamic, about this way of thinking for a while, but I've watched as the policymakers have taken it to the next level. That they have not just been deterministic in terms of their critique, they're starting to demand techno-solutionism of companies. So the most clear example of this right now has to do with what's going on in kids' online safety. And most of these frames actually started out in the UK, and you've actually ported them to my country, so thanks for that. And so one of the things is, and I have many feels about the porting, because it turns out when you have a country that's based on, we don't subscribe to the UN rights of the child, we don't subscribe to any rights of the child, so when you guys port your children's frames to the US, they become ways of parental control. But we'll leave that aside. Most of these kids' safety bills coming in the UK and the US are centered these days around a duty of care provision, right? And of course, we're going to talk about the duty of care in other legal contexts. But what's happening in this particular version is that the duty of care provision for kids' online safety presumes that because these social media companies have designed their technologies in ways that are harmful to youth, as they're arguing, and we can, again, critique that, but because they have designed there in a way that is addictive or disturbs their mental health, they must be inverted and redesigned to do good in the world. And so what you see are these bills coming out at the time saying, well, in order to help young people, you, dear company, are required by law to make certain that your site is not used for bullying or sexual predation or mental duress. That one's my favorite. And the reason what that means is that the companies are held liable for things that they cannot reasonably actually figure out how to do. I don't know about you, but the news gives me tremendous amounts of mental duress these days. And so the idea that these companies are liable for my mental duress terrifies me, because it's the answer, no news. I mean, I kind of would like the cats only app, but we'll work with that. So Maria Angel and I worked together and we started talking about how this concept we can understand as techno-legal solutionism, which is when the policies mandate technological outcomes as solutions to complex socio-technical systems. Now again, we're talking about the complexity of the system, right? It's a very different thing when we're talking about something much smaller. And people love to point to the ideas of seatbelts as an example here, right? And seatbelts are really fascinating because cars did not used to have seatbelts. And then there was tremendous research done that shows that if somebody actually is strapped into a vehicle, they are less likely to die in a car accident. That is a good thing. And so car companies were required by law to put seatbelts in, which it turns out then people did not use. And so then it went one step further and said, now that they're in there and they're required by law to be in there, now we can require by law that you have to use them, and we can take the next level. But there's something notable about the seatbelts. They had already figured out what the intervention should be. And that's very different than the kinds of duty of care provisions we're seeing around, say, kids' online safety. Because the duty of care provision here is not asking the car companies, please find all the ways to stop people from being distracted or falling asleep or otherwise killing people with their cars, right? It's much more saying this intervention changes the statistics, it adds friction, we think it's generally constructive, therefore make certain this intervention is available. That is a different mindset. And by the way, I'm very in favor of tech regulation that actually can go much more towards like, here are interventions. And by the way, again, from an American place where we still don't understand how to regulate data, much to my chagrin, I would start there. And also, if you want to go on the UK provisions, I start to think about advertising. These are things in which companies have complete control over, rather than trying to negotiate a complex social relationship. Okay, so as we think about this, I wanted to start thinking about how are some of the traps that we get caught up in. And this is where I spent a lot of time with my colleagues thinking about different kinds of traps that happen with different kinds of engineering logics. But I've started to realize that there are traps in policy making and rhetorical language. The first has to do with inevitability. Is that one of the things that's so fascinating to me is that marketers come out very loud and clear and rhetorically try to convince you that a future is a certain way. So what does it mean for us to collectively fall into that trap and reproduce it? This is our generative AI story right now, which is that for the last 2 years, there has been a drumbeat of everything is going to be changing. And so what has happened? It's not just that the technology is being developed, it's that every conference is about AI. Every funding opportunity is about AI. Every discussion and every faculty meeting is about AI. You're like, why are we all so obsessed with this? What does it mean that we are becoming part of this rhetoric? And so as I started to think about this, I started to realize that we're also sort of creating a situation where it's always the solution or the failure to solve things. And so I want to push back at this. And again, going right back to the title of my talk. I want to say that you should strike the word solution from your language entirely. It's a really interesting exercise. So click into your brain anytime you hit the word solution, be like, why am I saying this? Is this the right word here? Because this rhetoric comes with the inevitability trap. This idea that a solution is, the key to things, is part of how we become acculturated to the idea of determinism. So every time you start to think about that, I invite you instead to switch to the idea of an intervention. And this shift is a really interesting one, because what does a solution presume? It presumes that once you've solved the problem, you don't need to think about it again, right? Because why? It's solved. But an intervention is fundamentally different. An intervention says, I added a system here to hopefully go towards a better future, right? And I need to then check to see if I succeeded in that intervention to get somewhere. This, of course, is a place where you can pull on things like public health or any sort of medical science, right? You go in to see your doctor is doing an intervention. They're not solving a problem. They are intervening, which is why they make you do a follow-up, meeting after you've gone to the doctor, because they want to know if the intervention was successful or if there are all these other consequences because of that. And so when we start to think about those as interventions, we start to see how things start to play out with one another. We don't actually have to pay attention to this inevitability frame of mind. Of course, we also have to start thinking about how interventions have consequences at larger and larger scales. And one of the most important things to understand about interventions is that the consequences may not be immediate, right? You may have gotten a medical procedure that addressed an immediate issue in a way that the doctors were like, yay, good, only to have ripple effects down the line. And so it's about paying attention to that. So let's talk about that in the AI space. My favorite example here comes from Madeline Ellish. And she wrote this beautiful paper about the Federal Aviation Administration, and that's the US's regulatory body for thinking about how to deal with airplanes. And by the way, I've spent a lot of time reading and going deep into airplanes. This is not a way to make your neighbors on an airplane very happy with you. But I will give you some really great examples from things that there's a couple, by the way, don't watch movies of plane crashes on the plane. It will really upset your neighbors. It's okay, so what was Madeline looking at? Madeline was interested in the idea of autopilot, which of course is one of the earliest mass-scale AI systems. It turns out that by the 60s and early 70s, they understood that autopilot would be extremely helpful and planes were less likely to crash when autopilot was involved. And so it starts triggering this conversation. Should it be allowed? Right? It's a very important question. At the time, 3 people are sitting in any given cockpit, right? It was the pilot, the co-pilot, and the navigator. And in the US Congress, as this debate is falling out, it's like, forget the navigator, get that person out there. We now have enough consistent communication to the ground. We don't need the navigator. That part was really solved. But the big question was about what to do with the pilot and co-pilot. In the end, the US regulators decided we should keep the pilot and co-pilot in place so that they can take over from the machine in an emergency. Now, what has that meant in practice? That has meant that you have pilots who have been systematically de-skilled on the job. Their entire job at this point is to babysit a machine. Think about that the next time you're on a plane, by the way. They're there to babysit the machine, and when the machine goes wrong, they are to jump in and figure out what the heck is going on in record speed with beeps going at them in every which direction. And when planes crash, almost always it was the human that was last controlling them, and the human is then blamed. So it's pilot error on the ground. So Madeline calls this a moral crumple zone. And a crumple zone is the part of your car that absorbs pain on impact. And her point was that we've put humans in the loop, not to actually empower them, but to very much have them absorb pain on impact or liability or responsibility. And since they're dead, we tend to accept it. Now, there's really interesting examples that's happened since she wrote this that actually really make the story much clearer. And my favorite has to do with Captain Sully. Anybody seen the Tom Hanks film?
Yeah.
So Captain Sully is a really, really fascinating character. This is a plane who lands on the Hudson. Now, if you don't know much about aviation, landing a plane, a modern day plane on a river is insane, right? Like that is ludicrous. So what happens is he takes off in New York from LaGuardia Airport and he hits a flock of birds. So his engines go out. And so he's like, I've got to land this plane, right? This is a problem. I can't make it back to LaGuardia. And he's on the radio and everybody is like, go to Teterboro, go to Teterboro, go to Teterboro. Teterboro is a very small airport of like fancy rich people just in New Jersey. He's like, I can't make it to Teterboro. They're like, you can, all models say you should go there. He's like, I can't, I'm not going to, I'm gonna land on the Hudson. And they're like, you're out of your mind, you can't land on the Hudson. He's like, I can land on the Hudson. They go back and forth, he basically ignores them and lands on the Hudson. So in the post-analysis, there's a couple of things that come out that are really, really fascinating. First off, he couldn't have made it to Teterboro. It turns out that the models were based on outdated information about construction in New Jersey. He had enough experience to be like, I'm going to hit buildings. And he was right. The models were wrong. But there's another critical component, which is that he was like looking at this and being like, I would have gotten 5 extra minutes if I could have overridden this key part of the system. He was not allowed to override. Now, why is he so interesting? The thing that's so fascinating about Captain Sully, which makes him different than every other pilot out there, is that he's been so systematically decreased in his pay over the years that he had a weekend job. His weekend job was to retrain pilots how to fly when their systems went out, right? You are literally talking about the best person to land a plane in an emergency. And that's a really interesting moment because it is about that level of deep expertise that makes a huge difference in this equation. So fast forward again, and we get Boeing Max. The last crisis of Boeing Max, they continue to have amazing crisis. This was one about an MCAS system, right? This was again an AI system that was like, pilots now are stupid. They have been systematically de-skilled. They have been lower status, lower wages. They are useless. And so now, because they're so dumb, we're going to put in technology to override them. And one of those technologies that override was something called an MCAS system. The basic idea of an MCAS system is that when the planes were going at too steep of an angle going up, because of a whole set of bad decisions about Boeing, rather than, like basically the engines could have come out. So it forces the nose down, right? It's forcing the nose down like this. Well, the interesting thing about this is it all depends on exactly one sensor. Terrible design. And because Boeing didn't want to have everybody retrained, they didn't bother telling everybody. It was like literally in the footnotes. And so then you have a plane that crashes. First plane crashes off of Indonesia, and the pilots are blamed, right? And you get this, black box where everybody's like, oh my gosh, why is the plane, what's going on? Because what happened is that the plane thought it was going like this. The pilots knew the plane was going like this. And so because it thought it was going like this, it pushed the nose down straight into the water, right? Terrible, terrible thing. And so pilots are blamed, but everybody's like, oh, what is it about this black box that says this? Like, this seems really strange. And the amount of racist, pejorative stuff that came out to justify why these pilots must have been stupid was unbelievable. And then it happened again in Ethiopia. And by the way, that just continued a lot of racist, horrible stuff, just to be clear. But it finally, with that second crash, allowed this question to Boeing of just like, might your AI system not be working as planned? And it took a lot of effort to sort of disentangle and fully understand this MCAS system. And then, of course, all of those flights were on the ground for over a year, making a mess out of everything. But what does it mean that it's not just that we distrust pilots, it's that we've de-skilled them? And so what is this entire arrangement? And the reason I'm telling you that in an environment of AI is it's not just the technology. It's what it does to the entire arrangement, where power lies, where shifts can occur, and what can happen. Because at the end of the day, a human in a loop sounds like a really nice policy intervention, but it doesn't do us any good if that human hasn't been empowered to actually be able to intervene at the right time in the right place to actually make a difference. All right, so I'm trying to think positively. I'm not always the best at being positive, but I was trying to think about places where we can actually draw from and learn from in all of the spaces. And one of my favorites has to do with the security space. And I don't know how many of you have spent time with security people, but they're like glorified Eeyores, and I heart them for this. It's like, everything is wrong. Everything's gonna go badly, right? And you're just like, oh, you've lost your tail again. That's really cute. And so one of the things that's so notable about the field of security is that they don't ever think of a system as secure. It is a desired end goal. It's working to making it more secure and more secure and more secure, while sitting there being like, and they did it again. And so one of the reasons I think that's important for us to hold on to is that there is a Sisyphusian task involved in trying to regulate or make sense of technical systems with large attack surfaces. You can sit there and say, okay, we're going to prod at this point, but you need to see it holistically. Because again, we're back to the problems of solutionism, which is that it's great to tell a company, go make your system entirely secure, but good luck, right? And so it's this ongoing and never-ending process. But there's a way of also thinking about things as socio-technically secure. And what does it mean to think about it not just about unwarranted access to the very system, but what does it mean to think about it more broadly about what it does within society? So I have to say, I've been pretty humored watching all of the policymakers glom on to AI red teaming as the answer to everything. Nobody seems to know what that means, especially in industry. It's great. But it's supposedly the solution to responsible AI. And the idea with red teaming, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that the idea is to test the system as much as possible in advance of its launch. And it makes sense. Like, there's a lot to be said about the culture of testing. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that I actually spent the early part of my career as an engineer, as a software engineer, and I had a quality assurance engineer who sat next to me. Her name was Raven Arabus. That was amazing. But the thing about Raven is that every day I would go in and I would try to make something function, and she would come in the next day and be like, I'm going to destroy it, right? And I was like, okay, right? But the thing that was so valuable is you had two different ways of thinking sitting side by side. One who's trying to imagine how to create, one who's trying to imagine how to make it all break. And this was a beautiful back and forth, right? It was a wonderful, and at the time it wore a lot of color, so it was all the more ridiculous. But the thing is that by the time Web 2.0 came around in the tech industry, we assumed that the public would be our testers. So it's this whole culture shift to say, we'll throw it out there, and if it breaks, and you'll get a fail whale, right? But this is a huge challenge, is that we've lost a culture of doing testing. And so this is that moment where you're seeing an AI red teaming trying to bring back some semblances of a testing culture, but without a more holistic element. And I keep thinking about, again, I'm on an aviation kick. There's a lot to be said about how to think about testing in aviation. This is a place where there's a lot that's done. And it turns out the answer is not put a plane in the sky and just see if it works, right? Like that's not going to fly. Although I will note, since my cousin's in the room, that my grandfather did get to be on the Concorde as an aviation person just to make certain it flew. They made the operations people do that, which was great. But the reason I point this out is that the testing ecosystem around aviation is something to learn from. It's something very powerful. By the way, they throw chickens into engines. Fascinating. So how do we start thinking about what it means to build out a broader socio-technical framework? And again, it's not just saying like, hey, let's have security and we'll mandate that it's secure. It's about, again, figuring out those broader arrangements. Now, part of it is, of course, that the tech industry is obsessed with disruption, and for good reasons. The economic arrangement is such that the only way to win in a late-stage capitalist enterprise is to make certain that the return on investment keeps growing as fast as possible. And so investors are not just looking for companies to be profitable, they're looking for them to be cash engines on repeat. And I keep thinking back to this work of Manuel Castells, who's a Catalan scholar who I adore, who thinks about how power exists within networks. Now, he is very annoying for English speakers because he calls it network power, network power, network making power. Right. So the whole thing about his point there is that there's powers that exist within networks. You can start to see and identify and move across those structures. You can also start to build a network and make new connections. But the greatest level of power within a system is those who see the arrangements and can make the networks in their own terms. This is really important because what late-stage capital is about creating a disruption in order to capitalize on the rearrangements, right? That is the power of what's going on. And that is the story of what's going on in AI, is to do a massive disruption and then scramble to try to control where the profits flow in a moment. And this is where I keep going back to another big lesson in science and technology studies, which is the social construction of technology. So the idea of the social construction of technology, or SCOT for short, is that a technology, again, is not inevitable, it is not deterministic. When an innovation starts to emerge, it has a stage of interpretive flexibility. This is a way of saying that there's many different possible futures of that design. So it's my favorite example here is the bicycle, which is what they use historically, and it sort of contradicts everything you might have seen in the Social Network movie. And the idea is that a bicycle was not inevitably a two-wheeled object that was same-size wheels. There were many different designs that were all competing at the time for different kinds of design futures. And they had many different desired goals. Some of them were about speed. Some of them were about making it a social activity with multiple people. Some of them were about being able to bike with a skirt. There was a whole variety of different ways in which you could approach this. And what happens is that even though a new innovation has a lot of interpretive flexibility at the start, it quickly becomes something that is sort of more systematized over time. It becomes more stabilized. And the reason it becomes more stabilized is because standards start to matter. Because it actually turns out mass production is cheaper, right? And you want to build other things on top of it. Things start to become part of systems. And so what happens is you get this moment where you see a form of closure coming, and there's advantages to certain actors to get closure fast, and there's disadvantages to certain actors. So here's what's happening with the AI, especially the generative AI space right now. There are many possible futures of this space, and there was a lot of interpretive flexibility. But there are also a lot of actors who want closure fast, because they will financially benefit by creating closure around their standards and their systems as fast as possible. And so this is where rhetoric starts to come in, which is we sit there and spin this up and we'll be like, AI is inevitable, jump on our standard, regulate us which is another way of saying, make sure that my organization and company standard wins. And that is where we're in a really tricky place, because as we start talking about regulation in this space, the question is, are we actually trying to keep the moment of interpretive flexibility wide, or are we trying to maximize closure for the benefit of a few? So, I don't know what it turns out. I just talked over it. So in conclusion, one of the things I want you to do, again, remember, please strike the word solution anytime. Anytime you see it, just remove it. Second, focus on the arrangement. It's not the technology that matters. It is the broader arrangement around that. And so if you really meaningfully want to regulate AI, you don't regulate AI. You regulate finance. You regulate the flow of capital. Because if you regulate the flow of capital, you change the futures of different AIs, right? It's not about the technologies directly. And so when you're also thinking about this, and when you're trying to aim for responsible AI and you want these companies to be responsible, you need to see this not as a solutionistic thing, but as something that is a mindset. And that mindset needs to enroll all of us. All of us need to be a part of that responsibility. It's not something that's just done on a given company. It's done systematically in a way where we can all see that the attack surface is not just the technology, but it is actually all sorts of power dynamics within our society as a whole. And with that, thank you.
Just like to say very quickly, thanks so much to Dana for just such a fantastic keynote to launch the conference proceedings for the first few days. If I could, I see we have everyone in the room now. If I could ask everybody who's on our keynote panel to come join us up front, and then we will move straight on to our next panel. Thank you. Welcome everyone again to our keynote panel, and I am very excited to be chairing this panel also today. Our first speaker, I'm delighted to say, is Professor John Nocton. John is a recovering utopian who is also Emeritus Professor of Public Understanding of Technology at the Open University. He is co-founder of the Mindrew Centre for Technology and Democracy at the University of Cambridge, the Observer's Technology columnist, a blogger, and director of the Wolfson Press Fellowship Programme. And today, as I understand it, John will be discussing how scholars and commentators to date have framed and conceptualized the role of AI technologies and their societal impacts on society. Is that right? Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And apologies came into you because the train I was on didn't know you were talking. But I read your original draft and everything you recommended as associated reading, but I'm sorry I didn't hear you in place. Okay, do I need to use this?
Yes.
I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Some of us project,
Okay.
but the mic helps.
Okay. I think what I want to talk about in a way is what overhangs all of this. And it's basically ideology. Ideology is what determines how you think when you don't know you're thinking. And in relation to this particular technology, it affects everything that happens, and it also affects the way in which we think about it. I think tech determinism is an ideology. It's a belief that technology really drives history, and it has been weaponized very effectively by the tech industry, and their weapon of choice is a myth. It's the myth of inevitability, and it's a very powerful myth because it has infected almost everybody responsible for thinking about regulation in this industry. And it has also a wider context, which I'd like to come back to at the end. In a way, I want to return to where Dana finished. But if you want an example of of this inevitability myth in action and its flaws. Does anybody here remember the Internet of Things? If you go back a few years, 10 years, 15 years, that was going to be definitely the coming thing. Definitely. And even Phil Howard, who's normally a sensible guy, at Oxford, he actually wrote a book about it, called Pax Technica. He argued that the Internet of Things would be the most important tool of political communication we have ever built. He advocates in the book for more public input in its design and more civic engagement with how this information is infrastructure gets used. Okay, fine. But now, it seems to me that the best estimate we can get for the take-up of, quote, Internet of Things, i.e. networked devices, is less than 50% and probably in the region of 30%. It's been a flop. But it was going to be, once upon a time, not that long ago, it was going to be definitely the thing that would determine how it spanned out. We're hearing the same thing now. And I think it would be nice if we subjected what we're hearing, and I think Dana's talked about this, to more critical assessment. I think inevitability is a better term because it's the most dangerous aspect of determinism. It basically is a proposition which says, this is coming, there is nothing you can do about it, so you may as well kind of grin and bear it. And one of the most, I think, enlightening things that I've seen in the last few months is a paper by a former colleague of mine, Julia Pose, and another colleague in Australia, on how the myth of inevitability was weaponized by Google, or a branch of Google called Google Wing, the one that handles drones, and the way it was they made an attempt to impose it on some suburbs of Canberra in Australia, and they picked the wrong suburb. Because the suburb was full of people like you and me. People who are technically smart, who understand how ideology works, and who are good at mobilizing. And in the end, Google had to withdraw with his tail between its legs. And the thing that was very, very striking, there's a great paper about this published in Proceedings A of the World Society. The thing that's really interesting about it is that it's one of the few examples I've seen where technological determinism as weaponized in the inevitability myth actually can be better. And to some extent, it's basically an attitudinal matter. In other words, it's to have publics which have the confidence and the nous to say, you must be joking. I'm always reminded in this context of a famous event in Liverpool during the Great Depression when, I think it was Lady Nancy Astor, was addressing a large group of working class women. And she said at one point, a very nourishing soup can be made from fish heads. And a wonderful woman in the audience said, who ate the fucking fish? That seems to me to be an appropriate kind of attitude to this technology. And it's one that, as far as I can see, doesn't readily resonate with our current lots of regulators. But if we're going to do anything about this, we have to approach it like that. We have to say, you must be joking. And we don't. Instead of that, we have to put up with what we've seen in the last couple of years. For example, the most toe-cringing thing I have ever watched on a screen was the audience that Elon Musk granted to the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Any of you saw that? Well, if you haven't, go look at it. And then you'll see the kind of context in which we're trying to deal with this. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is some of the things that Dana has said and written about tech solutionism. When I hear it, what I'm always reminded of is H.L. Mencken's famous thing, which is that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. I'm an engineer, and engineers are kind of prone to solutionism. So I know what it's like, I sympathize with it, and in some circumstances, it's absolutely wonderful. I'd really like to see more of it, with one proviso, that it's a solutionism deployed in the public interest, not in the interest of large, unaccountable corporations. I think it's really ironic, and Dana and some of the readings she suggested as a backup to what she was going to say, is the way in which, in a strange way, tech solutionism is implicit in the thinking about good people who want to control aspects of this technology. I know from personal experience that they don't take kindly to the idea that in doing what they regard as being something for the public good, they're also buying into the inevitability of this. But it's true. And I think how to get that across to people is always going to be difficult. And the more motivated they are, and the better people they are, the harder they find the message to grasp. So I'd really like us to stop talking about solutions. And just to pick up on what Dana closed with, which is the idea that you have to think about all of this stuff in a wider context. She mentioned a particular example of that, but I think it goes wider. What we have to remember, those of us who want to rein in unaccountable tech power, what we have to remember is that for the last 5 decades, at least since the 1970s, liberal democracies have been very careful in crafting a governance and regulatory environment which unfailingly prioritizes the needs of large corporations. That's what we've been doing. We've been building an environment which has enabled corporations to grow, to prosper, to monopolize, and to exploit with very little, with almost not a whimper from democratic institutions. We've seen some whimpers in the last year or so, and we've seen occasional limited success, like, for example, the decision, the proposition from the Department of Justice in the US that Google should be able to get rid of, divest itself of Chrome. But that's the exception that proves a more depressing rule. And that's a big problem because it explains why it's so difficult to actually even start in a democracy to start bringing these corporations under control. There was a startling example, confirmation of that yesterday, I think, or the day before, in an interview in the Times newspaper with the current information commissioner in this country. And he was saying basically, look, I know we're entitled to fine these outfits and so on, but you know what, fines don't work. And he's right. The day the FTC clapped a $5 billion fine on Facebook or something or other, shares went up. So fines are just a cut for them, cost of doing business. So I find it's more better. It's better if we kind of engage with them and we sort of, well, the TLDR version of what he was saying, in my opinion, was we try and persuade them to improve their behavior. And my view of that is, for Christ's sake, this is a democracy, right? Or it used to be. And if you have been, thank you for listening.
very much, John, for that very provocative and very riveting set of questions to us all in the audience about the different ways in which the dynamics of the AI industry and AI governance and power all intersect. I thought it was an interesting point you made that all engineers approach these issues from the perspective of solutionism or finding a solution. And it made me think of a very good book, in addition to Philip Howard's book on the Internet of Things, which is still very good, by the way, so highly recommended, by David Howard, talking about law as engineers. And that's another really excellent book, but I've always been quite divided about whether lawyers perceive themselves or approach things as scientists or engineers, and whether that all depends on context. But before I get into that any further, it brings us nicely to our second speaker on this panel, which is Professor Orla Lynskey. Orla is Professor of Law and Technology at the University College London's Faculty of Law, the UCL. She is also a visiting professor at College of Europe, Bruges. Previously, she was an associate professor at LSE Law School, which she joined in 2012. Orla's research is concerned with the effective protection of fundamental rights and public values in the digital society. Her recent publications critically examine the legal implications of synthetic data and query the feasibility of complete and effective data protection, as the Court of Justice of the EU would have us believe is possible. Orla is an editor of the Modern Law Review Journal and joint editor-in-chief of the International Data Privacy Law Journal. And I understand she will be discussing the role of AI and regulation within the context of EdTech development. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I'm just going to see if everyone can hear me. I'll proceed like this, if that's okay. And I'm going to stay seated also because I've got scribbled notes on which I further scribbled, but I need to stay close to. And I just want to say, first of all, thanks to Nora for the invite this morning to hear Dana speak, which is a pleasure, and for the opportunity to offer some reflections on what she had to say. And I think there are many elements of what Dana said that we could pick up on and discuss. But as a lawyer, I'm going to zone in a little bit on the idea of techno-legal solutionism. So as Dana defined it, that's this idea of legally mandated technological solutionism. And I want to try to tie that notion a little bit to some of the discussions we've been having around the possibility and the way in which we should, whether we should and how we should design regulatory interventions in the digital space. And I guess let me begin by saying that I would be a very kind of poor advocate for the Online Safety Act and for the duty of care provision that's in there. I know there are lots of people in the room who have far deeper expertise on the OSA than I do, and also on platform regulation. But I do think it's important to go to the duty of care that Dana mentioned, and to take that maybe as an example of this techno-legal solutionism. So the idea that the legislature has put in place a legal mandate on digital platforms to introduce a particular technological solution to a societal or a legal problem. And in the paper, one of the papers that Dana mentioned, the one with Maria Hankel, she links this idea of techno-legal solutionism to kind of its intellectual history, I suppose, which is Joe Riedberg's Lex Informatica and Lawrence Lessig's idea of code as law. And here you can clearly see that legislatures are perhaps uncomfortable with the idea that law in and of itself might not be sufficient to achieve a stated aim, and so they want to leverage the possibility of using technological design in order to enhance the achievement of a particular legal aim. And we've definitely seen a shift in terms of regulatory frameworks over the past decade to use that kind of techno-legal solutionism. And I think if you look just at the UK, for example, in 2014, we have a report from the House of Lords, or the House of the Parliament, the Joint House of the Parliament on cyberbullying, where the very clear recommendation is that what is lawful offline should be lawful online. i.e. If we're to deal with something like cyberbullying in the digital context, we should deal with it in the same way that we deal with it in the playground, which is through the use of norms, going to use less legal language, rather than through legal intervention. Now, you fast forward a decade, and the Online Safety Act is clearly a very different legislative or regulatory response. And I think, one way to think of this is clearly simply as a moral panic, that we've all gotten kind of quite conscious or aware of the challenges that teenagers and young adults are facing in the digital world, and there's a kind of a good-natured response to that. I do think that there's another more normatively justified response to that also, and that is that we still have the kind of original harm, let's say, of bullying, which is an interpersonal behaviour that is clearly problematic but not illegal, but that harm of bullying is now qualitatively distinct because of the way in which it is amplified and targeted in a digital environment. And so this, I think, begs the question of whether or not law or regulation should accept that kind of qualitative distinction. And I do think you can see parallels in other areas of law. As a background, I was sort of many moons ago, I should say, I was a competition lawyer, and 101 of competition or antitrust law is that what is acceptable for your kind of regular company without monopoly power will not be acceptable for a company with market power. So we recognise that the exact same behaviour might be treated as qualitatively distinct due to the market factors or the power of the stakeholders involved in a given picture. You look at something like the European Court of Justice case law on the right to be forgotten, and we see that same type of reasoning. In and of itself, providing somebody with information from a search engine when you enter their name into a search engine is not problematic, but once you start to scrape all elements or elements from many aspects of a person's life into a single profile that you then make available to millions or billions of users, then you have a qualitatively distinct privacy interference. And so I think the first question here about this kind of regulatory intervention is whether or not the law should recognise these things as qualitatively distinct. And then, following on from Dana's talk, I think this requires us to think about what should an effective regulatory intervention look like, if we have a regulatory intervention at all. And here, I think there are obviously multiple ways in which regulating the digital is distinct from regulating the analog, say. But two things I think regulators and legislators are grappling with are, first of all, that the regulatory target is a moving one. And say de Gourses and Joris van Hoboken have written very elegantly about this in the privacy context, where they talk about privacy after the agile term. So the idea that when data protection authorities are trying to apply data protection laws, often they're doing so in a context where the initial conduct that they investigate has been changed iteratively, maybe even very simply just through changes of terms and conditions over a period of time. And so it's difficult for the regulator to actually figure out what exactly it is that they're regulating. There's a wonderful PhD student at LSE Law School, Malavika Raghavan, who's looking at a similar dynamic in India with the Aadhaar authentication system for social welfare benefits, and showing how the technical specifications for the Aadhaar system are in fact influencing the soft laws which apply, the constitutional or the administrative soft laws, which are applying as law in that context. And so this means that the agile environment, not to use like complete cliche, but that kind of dynamic environment is flipping on its head a lot of our predetermined conceptions around law. So the fact that law will be foreseeable, the fact that what we're trying to target through law will be stable, for example. And so this puts regulators into a new regulatory environment. And this is somehow how I understand, again, not necessarily to justify, because that's not my place, but how I understand something like the duty of care. So not necessarily as something outcome-based, you must achieve a particular outcome, but rather you must put in place a process that may deal with, you know, a predefined harm of some sort. And then this becomes a little bit like quality assurance, a kind of an iterative process, where regulators audit, and maybe if you look at something like the Digital Services Act in the EU, that's backed up by civil society organisations, also casting an eye on this process. And so you get multiple stakeholders seeing on an iterative basis whether or not there's compliance with regulation. But this is obviously kind of a brave new world from a regulatory perspective. It's very different from typical utilities regulation, as we've previously seen, I think. The second big change here, and this is very obvious, is one of scale. So in the data protection context, most people will be familiar with Nadia Pratova's work in the law of everything. Chris Millard and others have spoken about the law of everything applied to everyone. And so if we're talking about a legislative framework, for example, data protection, that takes into account pretty much all interpersonal relations, you have a query about how a regulator can have the capacity to oversee this. And so there are design or intervention choices to be made. Do you limit the personal scope of application of the law? For example, only focus on big tech, as we see in some instances, so have asymmetric regulation. Do you focus on everybody, but introduce elements of meta-regulation? So where you impose compliance obligations on everybody, but with a certain level of oversight by the regulation. And, you know, this, I think, again, is kind of challenging. These choices are challenging classic regulatory paradigms. Like, maybe say more about that in Q&A, because I don't want to go on too long. But this, I think, also begs the question that Dana raised, which is about how at the end of this, you know, a process, for instance, something like the GDPR, how would we know if the law is being effective? Is it because we see lots of entities who have, you know, ticked the box in terms of compliance? Is that an effective law? Or is it possible that entities would entirely comply with the law, but that we would still see that the law is ineffective, or that there is scope for breaches of the law, or harms that could nevertheless pursue? And again, from a legal perspective, we haven't really kind of tackled this. Which brings me to a final point. In the January edition of the Modern Law Review, that Laura mentioned, there's the publication of the Chorley Lecture, so the annual lecture. And the annual lecture this year was on the idea of, it was given by Professor Nikki Lacey, the gender scholar and the criminologist, critical legal scholar, on the idea of institutionalizing interpersonal ideas in law. And one of the big themes of the paper is that we have more law than ever before. And I think she attributes, you know, the reason why we have more law, so she demonstrates this empirically, that we have more law than ever before. But any of us working on law and tech would know that just from, you know, being another day, another law. But also, we can see it because we are now trying to capture through the law more interpersonal relations than we have ever captured before. So content moderation is in and of itself a kind of an interpersonal issue. And Martin Husbeck at LSE Law School also talks about, you know, something like DSA as a law that sits on top of all law. Whatever is illegal at national level in the EU is then, you know, topped off by a further law in something like the DSA. And I think there's a query here about how we deal with this kind of regulatory glut and what that means for effective interventions in the digital environment. And the problem I see with this is one of political incentives. So just as we might kind of balk at the idea of former prime ministers bowing down to Elon Musk, you equally see that with each parliament, for example, and you see it very clearly at EU level, it is not simply enough for the legislature to enforce the glut of laws that have come in the Parliament before, because there's no political kudos from that. There's nothing from a career perspective for somebody who is institutionally invested in the European institutions that comes from enforcing the law. The entire institutional system is geared towards creating more law rather than effectively applying what we have. And I also see that as a big problem in terms of thinking about effective institutional arrangements and effective institutional interventions in this digital space.
Thank you so much, Orla. There is so much to unpack there, which is very fascinating. I'm going to hold back wait until we get to the Q&A section before we explore a lot of those fascinating issues further. I'll make one quick point with regard to the challenge you mentioned, Orla, regarding the regulatory glut and the fact that in law and tech, we are surrounded by an atmosphere where there is a solution-driven context and paradigm whereby we're always seeing more laws and more regulation. However, I would caveat that to say that feels very much like the European experience. But I do wonder how other jurisdictions actually see what the approach is there. And I think that it is a European challenge that we should really be more mindful of, particularly from the perspective of how are we assessing the effectiveness of laws in terms of what they were originally put forward to do, platform regulation, other purposes. Going back to John's point, are they serving the public interest? Are they protecting human rights, for instance, in that respect? And I think going back to one of the really excellent points that Dana made too, with regard to looking at things within the framework of intervention and not solutions, that's how we should all be looking at every new law in every sector, but particularly in AI and data. How does this law address the issues or gaps of the previous laws in this space? What were those gaps, and what are additional laws like the Online Safety Act, like the DSA, for instance? How are they going to address the laws that they are being built on top of? Or are we dealing with a really unattractive Jenga situation where we're not assessing any effectiveness or any questions about rule of law, foreseeability, effectiveness, or human rights? So, before I continue to get sucked in, which I clearly did in that particular intervention myself, our next speaker on today's Keynote panel, I'm delighted to say, is Rosamund Powell, who is a senior research assistant at the Alan Turing Institute, where she is based at the Center for Emerging Technology and Security, CETIS. Her work at the Institute focuses on research exploring topics at the intersection of artificial intelligence, ethics, and policy. This has included work with UNESCO and the development of the 2021 UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI. Rosamund also holds a master's in the history and philosophy of science and technology from the University of Cambridge. Rosamund, you're very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I might press the microphone. I think it might help people to hear me. Can everyone hear me a bit better now? So thank you very much for having me, and I've really enjoyed hearing all of the contributions so far. As Nora mentioned, my day job now with the Turing is advising governments on topics like AI ethics, AI safety, etc. But I actually wanted to focus my contribution today instead on casting a historical lens on some of the themes raised by the other panelists and by Dana, as I think that lens can reveal a lot about some of the traps we continue to fall into when we're dealing with AI risk and AI policy. And also I might reflect briefly on some more positive things that I think have changed over the course of AI's history. And there is a specific example I want to draw on here, and some work I did looking at a conference which took place in 1972, which to my knowledge is the first conference where the founding fathers of AI, including people like John McCarthy, who first coined the term artificial intelligence, came together to consider what they thought to be their own social responsibility, what they saw to be the key risks of AI, and how they might address those. but the way in which they approached that topic, the conversations they actually had when they came together on the shores of Lake Como, I think reveal quite a lot around the theme of AI and power and why we continue to have so many problems. So the first theme that this group really exemplified in their discussions is technological determinism, because the group ostensibly described themselves as coming together to think about their own responsibility, about what they could do to address some of the risks that their research and machine intelligence might cause. But what they actually focused on was quite different. So they spent an awful lot of time forecasting the capabilities of AI systems. So they spent a lot of time saying, in how many years will we have AI which replicates human intelligence? Some of them thought within 20 years in 1972. But despite those really optimistic predictions of when they'd have human-level intelligence, they signed this conclusion which said, now is too soon to act. We shouldn't do anything now to address these risks, because we need to do more research first to really understand them. And by more research, they didn't mean philosophical research, social science research, they meant technical research into AI. And where they did consider solutions, which was quite narrow, they were technical solutions. So the big one this group advocated for in this conference was more research into AI programs that can understand other AI programs. And through that research, they thought they could really address some of those societal risks from AI. But ultimately, the solution that some of them really advocated for, and John McCarthy was a particular culprit for this, is actually just waiting for AI to provide the solution to the societal problems it might cause. And he wrote several different papers on this where he imagined that in the future, we should not worry about the risks because AI itself will solve those problems. So they focused very much on prediction, on waiting for the perfect solution before acting. And I think that focus on prediction and waiting is something we continue to see, especially in conversations around AI existential risk. The other thing I wanted to touch on very briefly here is the fact that AI actually has quite a complicated history with the idea of solutionism and solutions. So this group were coming together in 1972. And up until that point, their research was kind of a bit of a solution without a problem, which is something people often say about AI. And just before they came together to have this conversation, they had a bit of a panic because there was this report released called the Lighthill Report, which essentially led to the first AI winter where funding really dried up because these researchers were pouring money into something without having a problem they thought their research was going to solve. So actually what they ended up doing was kind of panicking and trying to think of what their solution AI was actually going to solve. So they spent a lot of time at this conference brainstorming industrial applications and things like that, which they could apply their nifty solution of AI to. The second theme I think this event and a lot more in AI's history really exemplifies is the theme of network power. So if you read through the conference proceedings from this, a lot of the risks they discuss, and they did identify risks to give them credit for that, really reflect some of the things we continue to talk about today. So they spoke about the risk of misuse of AI by political megalomaniacs. They spoke about the risk of loss of control of AI, and they spoke of the risk of kind of cutthroat competition and the geopolitical dynamics around AI. Weirdly, they spoke about the risk of like AI takeover as ambiguous as to whether good or bad. But I think what they did in this, they identified a lot of the risks that we're continuing to talk about today and big political leaders are continuing to grapple with. And for them, they would say, oh yay, we accurately predicted these risks because we're such technological experts and we could see ahead to all these things that AI was going to be able to do. But if you actually look a bit deeper at the history, the kind of technological underpinnings of modern AI, it's completely different. It was a complete downturn, reinvention. And instead, I would argue that they weren't able to predict the risks from AI based on technological expertise, but rather that network power, which meant that these were the very people and their students were going to be the people who went on to shape the institutions and dynamics which continue to dominate our discussions about AI and continue to shape which risks we actually focus on. And then finally, I wanted to turn a bit and try and be a bit more hopeful about what might have changed since then. Because when I say they accurately predicted risks that people in power continue to be most preoccupied with, and are real risks and real dynamics. Like, I'm not saying cutthroat competition in AI is not true, but there are risks they really didn't focus on. They didn't talk about AI bias at all. They didn't talk about risks to privacy at all. They didn't talk about the risk of unequal access to technology at all. And they didn't talk about things like workers' rights at all. And all of these things, I think, have been much more discussed by critics of AI than they have by maybe AI's founding fathers. And I don't want to say there wasn't discussion of this in 1972 and beforehand, because there was, it just wasn't happening with this group. But I think there has been some progress towards political actors having to recognise the real concrete harms from AI, in part because they've become a reality. So some of the risks this group talked about, like loss of control, are still quite ambiguous and we're waiting for them to happen, whereas things like AI bias are no longer possible to ignore because it's happening every day. And the other thing I think that's quite positive at the moment in AI policy making, and perhaps we can reflect on, I think John spoke about a bit, is the increasing focus on participatory research, public attitudes research, and how that can draw us in to the more tangible problems which are suitable for interventions now, as opposed to problems like loss of control, which it's really hard to deal with without proposing sort of ambitious solutionistic thinking. And also the rise of sector-specific approaches to AI, which really do focus on the AI life cycle as something iterative, where interventions need to be happening at every single stage and in an ongoing way, recognizing that that risk continues. So those were just some initial thoughts. I think that the history of AI can shed a lot of light on some of the traps we continue to fall into today, and it can be depressing looking at how little the conversation's moved on since 1972, but there may also be some glimmers of hope. So thank you.
I must admit, Rosamund, when you first began your presentation, I had some very exciting flights of fancy about my next academic grant, and how many of you would all be able to come to Lake Como, where we would discuss solutions to AI regulation and governance. But clearly, can you in? Okay, wonderful.
I was actually invited to Lake Como to have a very similar discussion once, and sadly I couldn't go because I would have lived out quite a fantasy doing that.
I do have to say that based on, however, on all the very fascinating critical insights that you then provided afterwards about the 1972 conference, it sounds as if that was the first attempt, and that more of us should try and see if that could be perhaps improved in future in terms of hosting such events in places like Lake Como. I do think, again, lots of really fascinating points, and thank you so much, that perhaps we can get into more in the Q&A, but I thought the point you raised, Rosamund, about a greater emphasis on participatory research in AI governance and regulation was really interesting in terms of then enabling a more interventionist approach rather than the focus constantly on solutions. And I also thought you raised a really interesting point about having a greater focus on specific AI sector governance. That perhaps is an area where you're going to have a more holistic understanding then too about specific issues, socio and technical, that arise because it's got more sector focus. But before again I digress, last but not least, I am delighted to introduce our final speaker and discussant on today's keynote panel, Mark Johnson. So Mark is head of advocacy at Big Brother Watch. His policy areas of interest are human rights and civil liberties. Previously, Mark was a parliamentary assistant where he worked on a wide range of domestic and international human rights issues. And Mark also studied politics at Stirling University. Mark, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Nora said, I am advocacy manager at the UK Civil Liberties NGO Big Brother Watch. Our work intersects the kind of relationship between human rights, civil liberties, and technology. When we think about AI, I think we so often think about the kind of big existential questions. But in line with the general theme of this conference, AI and power, I want to look at an example of techno-solutionism that is a bit closer to home. As I said, the name of my organisation is Big Brother Watch, but in 2024, Big Brother is not just watching you, he's also using AI to identify you and to track you as well. Since 2016, the Metropolitan Police here in London have been using a form of facial recognition called live facial recognition, which indiscriminately scans the faces of millions of Londoners and is used by the Met every single week now. As many of you will know, our face prints are a form of biometric data, and of course that means that they are very similar to, for example, a fingerprint. But unlike a fingerprint, your face print can be remotely scanned, making this technology more of a nefarious form of surveillance tech. This, of course, gives rise to serious privacy concerns, but also concerns around accuracy and bias in the facial recognition systems themselves. We so often hear the trope, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. But a case that we came across earlier this year completely shattered that mantra. In February, Sean Thompson, an anti-knife crime community worker, was walking back home after a shift in the London Bridge area. He was stopped by the Met Police, having been flagged by their live facial recognition systems. Sean protested his innocence and was forced to prove that he was not the person that they were looking for, an inversion of how that process should take place. After being held for around 30 minutes by officers, it became clear he had been misidentified by the live facial recognition system that the Met Police were using. Sean, who is a person of colour, is now taking legal action against the Met in a Europe-wide first involving a misidentification. And facial recognition not only engages rights issues, but it also engages rule of law issues too, because it is remarkable that despite these developments, there is no specific legislation here in the UK that governs the use of live facial recognition, leaving the police to write their own rules. In fact, until last week, this topic had never even been debated in Parliament, and there was a Westminster Hall debate on the topic, actually led by a Conservative Member of Parliament, which was remarkably the very first time that MPs have ever formally discussed the issue, despite the Met having used it having used live facial recognition since 2016. And this inaction leaves the UK lagging seriously behind other liberal democracies around the world that have voted to either ban or to restrict the use of this AI-powered surveillance technology. The greatest example of this is the EU's AI Act, which treats live facial recognition as prohibited except in a very select set of circumstances, and even then each individual use must be subject to judicial authorization. When regulating AI, I think it's important that we keep those principles that are integral to liberal democracies close. They are, of course, the protection of human rights, like privacy, respect for the rule of law, and a commitment to fairness. These values are already protected in UK law, and I think that we should build on these foundations as we seek to regulate AI. The issues around live facial recognition get to the very kind of heat of the relationship between the citizen and the state. This is a tangible example of AI-powered harms that are shrouded in the machinery of state surveillance. This is also a legal vacuum that I think that we have to fill, and when we do, it will be a piece of law that we have to get right, because if we don't, privacy in the UK could well become a thing of the past. Thank you.